The bullet hit him before anyone heard the shot. 1 second. Chief Petty Officer Daniel Marsh was standing at attention, in full-dress uniform medals catching the afternoon sun, jaw locked, eyes forward. The next second he was on the ground, blood soaking through the white ceremonial shirt, hands clawing at the grass, like he was trying to hold on to something that was already gone. Screaming erupted. Hundreds of people scattered. Military police dropped to cover positions. Medics froze. And then a woman nobody had ever taken seriously pushed through the crowd, dropped to her knees in the blood, pressed her hands against the wound without hesitation, and said a name. A name so classified it should not have existed outside a locked government file. Daniel Marsh stopped screaming the moment he heard it. Before we go any further, if you're watching this story for the first time, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week we release new cinematic stories, just like this one stories, about people who were counted out, written off, and pushed aside, until the moment the world had no choice but to pay attention. Drop a like on this video, and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The hospital sat on the edge of Crestford, Virginia, in that particular part of the state where the land couldn't decide if it wanted to be farmland or suburb, flat stretches of dry grass interrupted by strip malls, and beyond those, the low silhouette of the Blue Ridge foothills smudged against the western sky. Hargrove Military Medical Center was not a prestigious posting. Staff knew it. The patients knew it. The administrators worked very hard to pretend otherwise. It was the kind of place where careers either stalled or quietly died, and the people who ended up there were either waiting to be transferred somewhere better or had stopped waiting altogether. Nora Callahan had never been waiting. She arrived on a Tuesday in late October, carrying 2 bags, a set of her own trauma shears clipped to the outside pocket of her canvas tote, and absolutely no interest in making an impression. The nursing director, a compact woman named Sheila Yount, walked her through the ward with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done the orientation speech too many times to still mean it. "We run tight here," Sheila said, not looking at her. "Attending physicians have final word on everything. You document what you see, you report up the chain, and you do not freelance." "Clear?" "Clear," Nora said. Sheila glanced sideways. Nora had a face that was hard to read, not blank exactly, more like deliberately still. Kind of stillness that made people either trust you immediately or feel vaguely unsettled. Sheila landed somewhere in between. "Previous experience?" she asked, though she had the file in her hand. "Civilian trauma. Sometime working in rural clinics out west. Any military background?" A pause of maybe half a second. "No," Sheila nodded and kept walking. The floor Nora was assigned to the intermediate care unit, one step down from intensive, was staffed mostly by nurses in their late 20s and 30s who had cultivated a specific social architecture over years of 12-hour shifts together. They were not unkind exactly. They were simply closed. There was a hierarchy to how they moved through the space, who got the supply cabinet codes first, whose opinions got repeated in rounds like they had weight, and whose got absorbed into silence. Nora observed all of it and said nothing. Her first week, she caught a medication dosage patient on a post-surgical patient, a decimal point in the wrong place that would have caused a serious drop in blood pressure. She flagged it quietly to the attending physician doctor, Preston Hale, who looked at the chart she handed him with the expression of a man who had been handed something he found faintly insulting. "I'll review it," he said, and walked away. The order was corrected within the hour. Nobody mentioned it again. Nora didn't expect them to. She worked her shifts. She ate alone in the break room most days, not out of unhappiness, but because she was reading procedure manuals, mostly, and sometimes journals on battlefield trauma care, which she closed when anyone walked in. She knew what the cover looked like to other people, the new nurse who thought she was smarter than everyone else, sitting in the corner with her nose in a book. She had stopped caring about what things looked like a long time ago. What she had not stopped caring about was doing her job correctly. It was in her second week that she first encountered Raymond Cook. Cook was the chief of emergency medicine, the second most powerful physician in the hospital after the director, a man named Dr. Gerald Fitch, who mostly existed behind a glass office door and emerged for administrative meetings and hospital functions. Cook ran the actual floor, with the energy of someone who had mistaken authority for competence and never been corrected. He was loud in the way that people who've been told they're exceptional tend to be loud Not because they're trying to fill space, but because they genuinely believe the space is theirs. He noticed Nora the way a person notices something out of place on a surface they clean every day. "You're the new hire," he said, stopping in the middle of the hallway as she was updating a patient chart. "Yes. Callahan, right?" "Yes." He looked at her the way some men look at quiet women, trying to decide if the quiet was stupidity or attitude. "Where'd you train?" "University of New Mexico." "Then contract work." "Contract work?" he repeated, like it was a thing someone said when they didn't have a real answer. "You ever work with military patients before?" "Some." He nodded slowly, already losing interest. "We've got a function coming up. Hospital's co-hosting the annual Hargrove Memorial Ceremony. With the base, it's outdoors, by the East Lawn. Staff are required to be on hand for medical support." He glanced at her scrubs. "You'll be in the background. Don't complicate things." He walked away before she could respond. She didn't bother responding. The memorial ceremony was held on a Saturday in early November, when the air had finally made up its mind and turned cold. The east lawn of Hargrove Medical Center was adjacent to the main military installation, separated by a long stretch of flagstone walkway and a row of oak trees that had gone entirely bare, by then just black branches against a white-gray sky. The setup was elaborate for a government event: rows of folding chairs in military-precise lines, a raised platform with a podium and a color guard, 2 large mounted screens flanking the stage, showing the faces of the fallen. The brass were all there, generals and colonels and their aides moving through the crowd with the self-conscious authority of people who had spent their lives being watched. Nora stood near the medical support station set up by the tree line, roughly 40 meters from the main stage. It was her and 2 other nurses, Pam Gorecki, who was competent and quiet, and Marcus Webb, who was 26 and still a little raw. There was a crash cart, a supply bag, and a radio unit that kept cycling through static. She had been watching the crowd the way she always watched crowds, not consciously processing. Exactly. More like absorbing. Exit points, blind spots, the position of the security detail, the direction of the wind. She told herself it was habit. Then the shot happened. The sound came first, not the crack of a rifle, which carries direction, but the compressed pop of a suppressed weapon, which comes from everywhere and nowhere at once. It took most people in the crowd 2 full seconds to register what had happened. In those 2 seconds, Nora had already identified the direction of the shot by the way Chief Petty Officer Daniel Marsh fell backward and to the left, which meant the round had entered from the right sides of the chest, which meant the shooter was elevated in northeast. She was already moving while everyone else was still standing still. "Stay here," she said to Webb, not stopping. "We're not supposed to." She was already past the tree line. Marsh was on the ground, 20 meters from the platform, and the crowd around him was doing what crowds do, pressing in on 3 sides, which was exactly wrong, narrowing the airway he was trying to use, raising the temperature and reducing the oxygen, creating a wall between him and anyone who needed to reach him. 2 military police officers were trying to hold the line and failing. A man in a general's uniform was shouting something into a radio. A woman in civilian dress had her hands pressed to her mouth. "Move," Nora said, and then louder. "Move." She dropped beside Marsh, and her hands were already working before her knees fully hit the ground, 2 fingers at his neck, then her palm over the wound, applying direct pressure while she assessed. The bullet had entered below the clavicle. Exit wound behind the left shoulder. She could feel it when she slid her hand under him, the wet and ragged edge of tissue. Through and through, which was better than the alternative, but still catastrophic without immediate intervention. Marsh was conscious, barely. His eyes were open and tracking nothing. He was breathing in the short, shallow gasps of someone whose lung capacity was being stolen by blood-filling space that wasn't supposed to have blood in it. And then he spoke. Not words exactly. A sequence of numbers and a call sign that had no meaning to anyone in that crowd, except Nora. She froze for exactly 1 second, the only visible hesitation she had shown, and then she leaned down close to his ear and said 2 words quietly, in the tone you use when you're trying to reach someone whose mind is somewhere else entirely. The words were not his name. They were a designation. An operational call sign. The kind of marker that gets assigned to a unit in the field and never appears in any document that can be formally requested. Daniel Marsh stopped fighting. His body, which had been rigid with the locked muscle terror of severe shock, went loose in the way that actually meant his nervous system was releasing. rather than giving out. He turned his head toward her voice. His eyes found her face and couldn't make sense of it. "You're not," he started. "Don't talk," she said. "Breathe out slowly. I've got you." The military police officer standing closest had gone completely still. He was staring at her. She didn't look up. She was already assessing the lung working by feel, by the sound of his breathing, by the particular quality of the gurgling she could hear building in his chest. Pneumothorax, right lung compromised and filling. She needed to decompress, needed to do it now, and she needed something the medical station had, and she did not. "Bag," she said without turning. Nobody moved. "Someone needs to bring me the trauma bag from the medical station by the oak trees. Right now. Large bore needle, chest seal, and the laryngoscope if it's in there." The general's aide, a young captain who had been frozen in place for the last 90 seconds, broke out of it and ran. Marsh's eyes were still on her face. "I know you," he said. His voice was wrong, thin and waterlogged, but the certainty in it was absolute. "I know your voice. You're confused," she said evenly. "No." He tried to move and she held him still with a hand on his sternum, just enough pressure to communicate rather than restrain. "Kilo 7. The valley. You need to stop talking," she said. "I mean it. Your right lung is collapsing, and every word you say is making it worse." He stopped. The bag arrived. The captain dropped it beside her, and she unzipped it with one hand while keeping pressure on the wound with the other, a movement so fluid and automatic that two of the military police officers exchanged a look over her head that they could not have fully explained. She found the large bore needle, 14 gauge, which was what she wanted, swabbed the site's second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, where she could feel the tension building beneath the skin, and she inserted it with the angle and the pressure of someone who had done this before, not in a simulation, not in a controlled clinical setting, but in conditions where her hands were shaking and the light was wrong, and the patient was someone she knew. The hiss of released pressure was immediate. Marsh's breathing changed, not fixed, not yet, but the catastrophic worsening reversed itself, and color began to come back to his face in the slow, disorganized way of a body catching up. She applied the chest seal, worked the secondary dressing over the exit wound. "We need a gurney and a surgical team," she said to the captain. "Tell them bilateral chest trauma, controlled pneumothorax, blood loss is moderate. He's stable enough to move, but he needs OR within the next 40 minutes. Captain relayed it into his radio word for word. She did not look up until she heard the gurney wheels on the flagstone. Dr. Raymond Cook arrived at the medical station 7 minutes after the shot, which was roughly 5 minutes after Nora had already stabilized the patient. He came in with the energy of someone who expected to be needed urgently and had arrived to find the emergency already managed, which was its own specific kind of problem for a man like Cook. He looked at Marsh on the gurney. He looked at Nora kneeling beside him, still holding the secondary dressing in place. He looked at the needle she had used and the chest seal and the positioning of the patient, and his face went through several adjustments before it settled on something that was not quite anger and not quite uncertainty, but lived uncomfortably between the two. "What did you do?" he said. "Needle decompression," she said. "He had a tension pneumothorax developing. If I'd waited." "You're not authorized to perform that procedure outside of a physician-supervised context." She looked at him then. Just looked at him. He would have arrested within 4 minutes. That's not the point. It's exactly the point. The gurney team was loading Marsh now. She stepped back to give them room, stripping off her gloves, and Cook moved to put himself between her and the gurney in a way that she recognized immediately not practical, not medical, just the physical assertion of hierarchy. "You operated outside your scope," he said, lowering his voice, but not softening it. "Protocol violation. There will be documentation." "Document it," she said. He blinked. He had expected something else, apology, probably, or at least defensiveness. Flat acknowledgement threw him enough that he didn't say anything else before the gurney moved away. Nora pulled off the second glove and dropped both in the biohazard bag by the station. Her hands were completely steady. They had been steady the entire time. Pam Gorecki was standing 3 feet away. She had watched the whole thing, the intervention, the procedure, the exchange with Cook, and her expression was the expression of someone quietly revising a calculation they had already made. "You've done that before," Pam said. Not a question. "Done what?" "A field decompression. Without imaging. Without a physician." "I did what needed doing," Nora said, and began restocking the trauma bag. The military investigators arrived before the ceremony was officially dismissed. There were 4 of them, 2 in uniform and 2 in civilian dress, and they set up in a conference room on the administrative floor with the particular efficiency of people who had done this kind of thing in less comfortable settings. They wanted statements from everyone in the medical support area. They were specifically interested in the individual who had first reached the wounded officer and performed the initial intervention. Nora went in third. The investigator who led her interview was a woman named Major Diane Hartwell Army, Intelligence Branch, the kind of composed that came from discipline rather than temperament. She had Nora's personnel file open on the table in front of her, and she kept her eyes on it for a long moment before she looked up. Callahan, she said. 12 years as a registered nurse. University of New Mexico, then contract work in rural New Mexico and Colorado. She paused. Before that, I was in school. Community college, it says here. 2 years undeclared, then transferred. Hartwell looked at her. That's an unusual path to nursing. I took a while to find my direction. Hartwell turned a page. The procedure you performed today, needle thoracostomy, is listed as a skill in your nursing file, acquired through a trauma certification course 3 years ago. She looked up again. 3 years ago, yes. You performed it under pressure, without imaging, on a moving patient, with improvised positioning, in approximately 90 seconds from opening the bag. Hartwell's voice had not changed in register or tone at any point in the conversation. That's a very specific skill set for a certification course. Nora held her gaze. I read a lot. The silence that followed lasted long enough to become something other than a pause. Chief Petty Officer Marsh, Hartwell said, is a decorated Special Operations serviceman with multiple combat deployments. During his initial assessment after your intervention, while he was still in acute distress, he reported hearing a voice he recognized from a classified operation. She closed the file. He mentioned a call sign. Kilo 7. Do you know what that means? No, Nora said. It was not entirely a lie. Kilo 7 was not her designation. It was the operation. Her designation had been something else. He also said. Hartwell paused deliberately, watching her, that whoever reached him first had hands that moved like a combat medic. His exact words were, "She's been in the field." Another pause. Does that mean anything to you? He was in severe shock, Nora said. People say things they do, Hartwell agreed pleasantly. They also sometimes remember accurately. She stood, which closed the interview without explicitly ending it. Thank you for your time, Ms. Callahan. We may have follow-up questions. Nora walked out of the conference room and down the hallway to the elevator, and she stood inside it alone. For the 45 seconds it took to travel from the 4th floor to the 2nd, and she let herself feel what she had been not feeling for the past 2 hours. She was careful about it. She had practiced being careful. Then the doors opened, and she walked back onto the ward. That evening, after her shift ended, she sat in her car in the parking structure for 11 minutes before starting the engine. The hospital lights were orange against the concrete ceiling. Someone had left a coffee cup on the ledge of the parking space in front of her, and it was still there from this morning, which she knew because she had noticed it on the way in. She thought about Daniel Marsh's eyes when he'd heard those 2 words, the recognition in them, the absolute bone-deep recognition from a man who had never seen her face. She thought about Hartwell's file, which had her listed as a nurse from Albuquerque, who took a long time to finish school. She thought about the call sign the injured man had been shouting, the valley he had mentioned, the specific angle of light in a specific mountain pass years ago, and the smell of smoke and copper, and the sound of a helicopter that was taking too long to arrive. She started the car, but before she pulled out, her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Unknown number, government prefix. She stared at it for a long moment. Buzzed again. On the 3rd buzz, she picked it up. Callahan. It was Hartwell's voice, unhurried, precise, with the same controlled calm from the conference room. I want to be straightforward with you. We pulled the hospital's background check documentation this afternoon. Your employment records are consistent. Your nursing credentials, check out. A pause. Problem is that Chief Petty Officer Marsh's medical record from 6 years ago contains a field report that references a civilian contractor medic attached to his unit during an extraction in a location I cannot name on an unsecured line. That medic's file is classified at a level I don't currently have access to. Another pause. But the physical description matches. Nora did not respond. I'm not calling to threaten you, Hartwell continued. I'm calling because Marsh came out of surgery 40 minutes ago, and the first thing he said when he woke up was the name of a person. Call sign. A name. She paused. He said, find her. He said she was the reason his whole unit came home. And he said, and I'm quoting directly, she's been running from something that was never her fault. Parking structure was very quiet. I don't know who you are, Hartwell said, yet. But whoever you were before you became a nurse in Crestford, Virginia, that person saved a man's life today in a way that no certification course explains. Her voice did not change, but something in the texture of it shifted slightly, something that was not softness, but was adjacent to it. Marsh is asking for you. He's asking for you by the name in that classified file. The line went quiet. Nora sat with the phone pressed to her ear for a long time after Hartwell stopped speaking. The orange light of the parking structure hummed above her. Coffee cup on the ledge in front of her was casting a thin shadow. She thought about the name Hartwell had not said. She thought about the last time someone had said it. And for the first time in 4 years, Nora Callahan felt the specific particular weight of a door she had locked a very long time ago, not breaking open, not swinging wide, just beginning quietly and without her permission to move. She put the phone down on the passenger seat without answering, not because she didn't know what to say, because she knew exactly what saying anything would cost. The engine was running. She sat with her hands on the wheel and stared at the concrete wall in front of her and counted backward from 10, an old trick, not a meditation thing, just a way to slow the part of her brain that had already started calculating routes and contingencies and what she would need to pack if she left tonight. That part of her brain was fast and thorough and had kept her alive in conditions where fast and thorough were the difference between walking out and not. But it had also made her reactive in ways she'd spent 4 years learning to interrupt. She got to 3 and stopped counting. Then she picked up the phone and called back. Hartwell answered on the first ring, which meant she had been holding the phone. I want to see him, Nora said. I thought you might. Not as an interview. Not with investigators in the room. A pause. That's a complicated ask. He's post-surgical. He needs quiet. If you put people in that room with recorders and uniforms, his blood pressure is going to spike, and his lung isn't going to thank you for it. She kept her voice clinical, because clinical was the one register that was hardest to argue with. Give me 15 minutes with him. Alone, then you can ask whatever you want. Another pause, longer this time. Nora could hear the specific quality of silence that meant someone was deciding something they hadn't fully decided yet. 20 minutes, Hartwell said. 3rd floor recovery. Clear the room. But Callahan, she stopped. What? If you walk out of this hospital tonight and I don't hear from you again, I'm going to have a very hard week trying to explain why I gave a classified inquiry subject unsupervised access to a material witness. I'm aware of that, Nora said. She pulled out of the parking structure and drove back to the entrance. The 3rd floor recovery wing was quieter than the rest of the hospital in a way that felt deliberate lower lights, slower movement, the particular hush of a place where people were being carefully reassembled. A nurse Nora didn't recognize was stationed at the far end of the hall and gave her a look that said she'd been told to expect someone, but hadn't been told much else. Nora showed her badge. The nurse checked something on a tablet and pointed to room 14. She stood outside it for a moment. She wasn't nervous. She was something else, the feeling of arriving at a place you have thought about for years without intending to think about it, and finding that it looks nothing like you imagined and exactly like you imagined, simultaneously. She pushed the door open. Daniel Marsh looked worse than he had on the lawn, and better than he had any right to look, given what had happened to his chest cavity 4 hours ago. The surgical team had done good work. The drainage tube was placed correctly. The monitors were reading steadily, and his color had come back to something in the vicinity of normal. He was not asleep. He had been watching the door. When he saw her face, something happened in his expression that she didn't have a clean word for. Not shock, he'd had time to prepare for the possibility. Not relief exactly. More like the specific feeling of a piece of information your body already held, finally being confirmed by your eyes. Cut your hair, he said. His voice was rough from the intubation, but it was his voice, the flat, unhurried cadence she remembered from radio transmissions and shouted commands through wind and dust. 4 years ago, she said, closing the door behind her. Looks different. That was the point. She pulled the chair from the corner of the room and sat beside the bed, not close enough to be intimate, close enough to keep her voice low. She checked his drainage output out of habit, still sanguineous but decreasing, which was what she wanted, and then made herself stop doing that and look at him instead. Daniel Marsh was 41, or close to it. He had the face of someone who had spent a lot of time in sun and wind, and not enough time in places with roofs. There was a scar along his jaw that hadn't been there 6 years ago, and his hair was shorter than regulations required, which probably meant he'd been recently separated from a unit that had relaxed standards. He was looking at her with the direct, assessing attention of a man who had spent his career reading people fast. "How long have you been here?" he asked. Not Crestford. Here meaning the life she was in. "Almost 2 years. Nursing. Nursing." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the room, footsteps passed and faded. "You were good at what you did," he said. "I want you to know that I knew that, even when I couldn't say it. You don't have to. I'm not doing it for you." His voice was even. "I'm doing it because it's accurate, and I didn't get a chance to say it at the time." He shifted slightly, and the small wince he couldn't suppress told her the intercostal nerves were waking up, now that the shock was wearing off. Kilo 7 extraction. 4 operators on the ground, 2 of them critical 12-hour wait for medevac, because the weather closed the valley. "You kept 2 men alive, with a kit that wasn't rated for what you were doing with it. I had training." "You had training and you had something else," he said. "You made calls in that valley that a trained physician would have second-guessed. You didn't second-guess." She looked at her hands. Were still steady. They were always still steady, which had always bothered her more than shaking would have. Like, her body had learned to perform calm without actually having it. "What happened after?" she asked. "After the extraction." "After you disappeared, you mean?" "After I left." He watched her for a moment. There was an inquiry. The mission had a bad outcome on the intelligence side. The objective wasn't met. 2 civilians were caught in an airstrike that wasn't supposed to happen. The unit was investigated. You were listed as a contractor attached to the unit, and your file got folded into the classified section of the inquiry. He paused. "Finding." She didn't move. The finding was that the intelligence failure was systemic above the unit level. Nobody on the ground was responsible for the airstrike. His voice was careful, in the way of someone delivering information they know has weight. "You were cleared. Nora, you were cleared 4 years ago, and nobody could find you to tell you." The monitors beeped steadily. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rattled past. She had spent 4 years carrying something that had apparently been put down without her knowledge, and the specific absurdity of that, the particular flavor of it, made her chest do something she hadn't expected. She didn't say anything for a while. "I heard you today," he said, "before I could see you. You said the identifier from the Kilo 7 briefing documents." He paused. "How did you know I'd respond to that?" "You were in shock. You were somewhere else. I needed to reach where you actually were." She looked up. "I shouldn't have used it, but it worked." "It worked," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "Hartwell is going to want answers." "I know. She's good. She'll find the file eventually. Classification level has probably been downgraded by now. Those things have shelf lives." He looked at her directly. "What do you want to do?" It was a genuine question. Not leading, not strategic. The question of a person who understood that she had a choice and was asking what she wanted to do with it. She had not been asked that in a very long time by someone who actually meant it. "I don't know yet," she said. It was the first completely honest thing she had said to anyone in 2 years. She gave Hartwell 40 minutes instead of 20 because Marsh fell asleep, mid-conversation, not dramatically, just the way heavily medicated post-surgical patients did. Between one sentence and the next, and she stayed until she was sure his breathing was stable and the drainage tube hadn't shifted. Then she found Hartwell in the hallway, sitting in one of the plastic chairs outside the room, with a paper coffee cup and a face that had rearranged itself into something professionally neutral. "He's asleep," Nora said. "I heard." Hartwell stood. She was shorter than she seemed in the conference room, compact and precise in the way of someone who ran, probably, and took it seriously. "Walk with me." They went to a family consultation room at the end of the hall, the kind with carpet and 2 couches and a tissue box on the table, designed to absorb the specific kind of grief that needed furniture with some give to it. Hartwell did not sit down. Neither did Nora. "I'm going to tell you what I know," Hartwell said, "and then I'm going to tell you what I think, and then I'd like you to respond to both." "All right. What I know, your employment records are legitimate. Your nursing credentials are legitimate. And your background check is clean because whoever built your file did a competent job." She paused. What I think, your name is not Nora Callahan, or it wasn't originally, and at some point in the last decade, you were attached to a special operations unit in a capacity that required a security clearance you don't currently claim to have. Another pause. Am I wrong? Nora considered her for a moment. Hartwell had the quality of someone who would not be managed, who had developed a precise immune response to being handled, and could identify it happening in real time. You're not entirely wrong, Nora said. That's not a confirmation. What I can give you right now. Hartwell looked at her for a long moment. Here's my problem, she said. There was a shooter today. We have a wounded officer, a disrupted military event, and a security failure I need to document completely. Part of that documentation includes everyone who interacted with the victim. She set down the coffee cup. I can work around a lot of things. I cannot work around a direct misrepresentation on a federal facility employment form. I know. So I'm asking you, and I'm asking as someone who watched you save a man's life today in a way that I have not seen outside of a combat theater, to give me something I can work with. The tissue box sat on the table between them. The carpet was a corporate beige that someone had probably chosen specifically because it showed nothing. Nora said, give me 72 hours. To do what? To decide what I'm willing to say and to whom. She held Hartwell's gaze. I'm not running. I have nowhere to run to that I haven't already been. A beat. Marsh told me the finding from the inquiry. I'm aware of what my options are. I just need time to think about which one I want. Hartwell was quiet. Then, 72 hours. But I need a phone number that actually reaches you. You already have one. You called it an hour ago. Something that might have been a very small, very controlled expression of amusement crossed Hartwell's face and disappeared immediately. All right, she said. Nora walked out. She did not sleep that night. She wasn't agitated. Agitation implied a kind of internal noise she had mostly trained out of herself. She was simply awake, in the specific way she sometimes went awake when something had shifted in the landscape, and her brain refused to file it as normal until it had fully processed the change. She sat at the kitchen table in the apartment she had rented 2 years ago, 3rd floor. Corner unit, 2 exits, nothing on the walls with a glass of water she wasn't drinking, and thought about what Marsh had said. Cleared. 4 years ago. She tried to find the feeling that should come with that, and what she found instead something more complicated and less clean, because clearing her didn't change what had happened. It didn't unburn the houses or uncall the airstrike or return 2 years of a life she had spent being very carefully nobody. The formal exoneration of a thing and the actual weight of it were different objects entirely, and she had learned that lesson young enough that she was not surprised to find it still true. What she was surprised by was Marsh. Not his presence. She had known abstractly that the people from that valley existed somewhere in the world and moved through it, but the specific reality of his face, the scar on his jaw, his voice coming out of a man who'd had a chest tube inserted 4 hours prior, saying, "We're good at what you did." She had not let herself think about that valley in a long time. She thought about it now. The morning brought 2 things she hadn't expected. The first was Dr. Raymond Cook, who appeared in the break room at 6:45 a.m. 30 minutes before her shift was to start, with a printed document and the expression of a man who had spent part of the night deciding to do something and was now committed to it. Protocol violation report, he said, setting it on the table in front of her coffee. Filed it last night with Dr. Fitch and with hospital administration. They'll want a formal response from you within 48 hours. She looked at the document. It was thorough. Cook had documented the procedure, the setting, the absence of physician supervision, and included a section arguing that her actions, though the patient had survived, represented a systemic risk to hospital liability. He had cited 4 separate policy codes. He had also, she noticed, spelled hemopneumothorax correctly, which meant he had either looked it up or already known it, and either way had done this carefully. I see, she said. This isn't personal, he said in the tone people use when something absolutely is. I know. You performed an invasive procedure outside your authorized scope. It doesn't matter that the outcome was positive. The protocol exists for reasons. Picked up her coffee. What would the outcome have been if I'd waited for authorization? It's not. He had approximately 3 to 4 minutes before respiratory failure. The nearest physician on site was you, and you arrived 7 minutes post-incident. She said it without heat, without emphasis. I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm answering the question. Cook's jaw tightened. That's for the committee to determine. Yes, she said, it is. He picked up the document, she hadn't touched it, and walked out. Pam Gorecki was at the counter behind him, pretending to read a schedule printout. Cook left, she turned around. He submitted that last night, Pam said. Around 9. I heard Sheila talking about it this morning. Figured. Sheila thinks it's going to go nowhere. The military's involved now. Fitch isn't going to want to document a protocol violation against someone who's part of an active federal inquiry. Cook doesn't know about the inquiry, Nora said. Pam looked at her. You think that's going to stay quiet? Nora thought about Hartwell's carefully neutral expression, and Marsh's room with the cleared observers, and the particular way institutions leaked information they were supposed to contain. No, she said. I don't. The second unexpected thing arrived at 11 a.m. in the form of a man she had never met, which meant he was either from Hartwell's office or somewhere adjacent to it, and neither option was comfortable. He was waiting in the consultation room on the same carpet, the same tissue box, and he stood when she came in, which was either courtesy or a habit of formal settings. He was mid-50s, civilian dress, the specific kind of unremarkable that was itself a tell. People who wanted to be noticed did not wear that shade of gray. He introduced himself as Warren Solis. He did not say which office. I'll be brief, he said, which she appreciated. Chief Petty Officer Marsh submitted a formal request this morning for your participation in a debrief regarding the Kilo 7 extraction. This request was routed through his chain of command and flagged because it references a contractor file with a classification level that creates certain complications with your current civilian status. He paused, as if giving her room to say something. She didn't. The complications are manageable, he continued. What is less manageable is that the formal submission of that request has made your file, or the existence of your file, visible to people who weren't previously aware of it. He folded his hands on the table. One of those people is a man named Gerald Fitch. She went still. You know that name, he said. It was not a question. He's the hospital director. He is now, Solis said. Prior to that, he spent 12 years as a civilian defense contractor attached to several special operations logistics programs. He let that settle, including a program that ran concurrent with the Kilo 7 operation. The room was very quiet. Fitch was not on the ground, Solis said. He was never in the valley, but he was involved in the intelligence coordination chain that produced the targeting data that led to the airstrike. He paused again. The inquiry found systemic failure. It did not name individuals at the contracting level because the classification structure at the time protected that information. Nora was looking at him with a flatness in her expression that she could feel from the inside, the specific kind of stillness she went to when she needed to think without broadcasting that she was thinking. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because Fitch knows your file exists now. He doesn't know who you are yet. The name Nora Callahan means nothing to him. But he will make inquiries, and those inquiries will eventually intersect with Hartwell's investigation. And at that point, he stopped. At that point, the situation becomes considerably more complicated. For whom? He met her eyes. For everyone. She sat back in the chair. Tissue box was still on the table. She had a sudden and irrational awareness of it, the mundane beige ordinateness of it, sitting there absorbing no grief at all while she absorbed this. What does Marsh know about Fitch? She asked. Nothing yet. Hartwell? I'm meeting with her this afternoon. Are you? She said. Not a question either. Solis closed the folder he had brought, which had been open on the table without her ever seeing what was in it. You have options, he said. But the window in which those options remain clean is narrowing. He stood. I'd suggest moving quickly. He left. She stayed in the chair for a long time, looking at the place on the table where his folder had been. Gerald Fitch. She had walked past his glass office door 40 or 50 times in the past 2 years, had received his form letter welcome email when she was hired, had seen him at the all-staff meeting in January, standing at a podium talking about the hospital's commit to excellence, and had thought nothing of him, had categorized him as background detail in a life she was building to be invisible. Thought now about the targeting data, about the 2 houses, about the 12 hours in the valley, and what she had known and not known at the time about why the medevac was delayed. She found Marsh awake at 2 p.m., and better sitting up at an angle the nurses had probably already told him was too much, with the drainage tube and the monitors, and the specific restless energy of a man whose body was healing faster than his patience could accommodate. Solis came to see you, he said before she'd closed the door. Morning. He tell you about Fitch? Yes, she pulled the chair. You knew? I found out last night. Made some calls. He paused. When you worked here, you never connected it. Why would I? I wasn't looking. She looked at him. Are you looking at me like I should have been? No. He meant it. I'm looking at you like I'm angry at. Got this close before anyone connected it. The monitor beeped. His oxygen sat was good 97, which was solid for 20 hours post-chest trauma. Fitch is going to figure out who I am, she said. Probably within 48 hours. Solis thinks less. And when he does, he's going to try to discredit whatever comes next. Anything involving me becomes tainted if he can't establish that I have a grievance. That's the playbook, Marsh agreed. It's not a subtle one. No. She was quiet for a moment. The inquiry finding the one that cleared the unit. What form does that take? Is it accessible? He looked at her carefully. If the classification level has been downgraded, which Solis thinks it has, it would be a formal document in a Defense Department archive. Accessible through proper channels, with the right request. How long does that take? Normally? Weeks, with someone applying pressure. He stopped. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that if Fitch moves to discredit me, the most effective counter isn't defending myself. She met his eyes, making sure the actual record exists somewhere it can be read. Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then, you'd have to be willing to be visible. I know, not just visible. On record. Your real name, your real file, your real history. I know, she said again. He studied her. 4 years is a long time to be nobody. Yes, she said. It is. Outside the room, the ward went on its regular rhythms, carts and footsteps, and the low beeping of machinery doing its patient work. Marsh looked at her with something in his face that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, but occupied the complicated territory between them. You don't have to do this, he said. I know that too. He nodded slowly. What do you need? She thought about Cook's protocol report, sitting somewhere in Fitch's administrative chain. She thought about Hartwell's 72-hour window. Thought about Solis and his unremarkable gray suit and his careful, narrowing language. I need to know, she said, whether Hartwell is someone I can trust with the full story. Marsh didn't hesitate. Yes, you're sure. I've worked with investigators for 20 years, he said. She's the kind that actually wants to know what happened, not the kind that wants to know what's useful. He paused. There's a difference. I know there is, she said. She stood. She was almost at the door when he spoke again. Nora. She stopped. Whatever you decide what you did in that valley was right. I need you to have heard that from someone who was there. His voice was rough, still, from the tube, from the effort of talking this much post-surgery, but it was steady, not from a file, from a person. She held the door handle for a moment. I heard it, she said, and she walked out. Found Hartwell at 4 p.m. in the same conference room on the administrative floor, which had apparently become their room by default. Hartwell had 2 cups of coffee this time, and she pushed one across the table when Nora sat down. You're early, Hartwell said. 72 hours felt ambitious. Hartwell looked at her. Solis briefed me an hour ago. Thought he might. Fitch. She said the name flatly, like she was putting it down and looking at it. Complicates the investigation. Yes. Hartwell stopped, choosing words with the precision of someone who did this for a living. Changes the shape of what I'm investigating. I came here about a shooting. What you're describing, if it connects the way Solis thinks it does, is significantly larger than a shooting. I know. Hartwell looked at her for a long moment. I want the full story, she said. Not the version you've been telling, the actual one. Nora picked up the coffee cup. It was too hot still, but she drank some anyway, because her hands needed something to do that wasn't fold together on the table and reveal how much she was working to keep this conversation moving at a pace she could manage. If I give you the full story, she said, I need to know that the inquiry finding gets pulled from archive and formally entered into this investigation's record. All of it, including the sections that name the contracting chain. Hartwell's expression shifted, not surprise, exactly. More the particular alertness of someone who has just seen where a road is going and is deciding whether to follow it. You think Fitch is in those sections? Solis does. What do you think? Nora set the cup down. She thought about a valley with one exit and no working radio for the first 2 hours. She thought about the coordinates that had been off, by a margin too precise to be error. I think, she said slowly, that the intelligence failure that caused the airstrike was not random. I think it was the result of decisions made by people who were protecting a contracted position that the objective of that operation threatened. She held Hartwell's gaze. I think the inquiry found systemic failure, because systemic failure was easier to document than individual culpability. And I think Gerald Fitch, who was in that contracting chain, has spent the last 6 years in positions that kept him adjacent to military infrastructure without being subject to military oversight. The room was very quiet. That's a significant allegation, Hartwell said. I know what it is. Do you have documentation? Not with me, but I know where to look, and I know what questions to ask. She paused. What I don't have is time, because if Fitch identifies me before you have anything on record, he will move to have me removed from this facility on the basis of Cook's protocol report. And once I'm not on staff here, my access to this investigation changes. Hartwell was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Nora counted seconds out of habit and got to 23 before Hartwell moved. All right, Hartwell said. She reached into the bag beside her chair and produced a small digital recorder. She set it on the table between them and looked at Nora without touching it. Whenever you're ready. Nora looked at the recorder. She thought about the person she had been before the valley, and the person she had been after it, and the person she was now, the accumulation of all three, sitting in a beige conference room, about to put her real name on record for the first time in 4 years. She reached out and pressed the button. My name, she said, is not Nora Callahan. Across the hospital in the glass-walled office on the executive floor, Dr. Gerald Fitch had just finished reading a flagged security cross-reference that had arrived in his inbox 11 minutes ago, a document generated by Marsh's debrief request, containing a contractor file number, and, attached to it, photograph from a government ID issued 9 years ago. He was looking at the photograph. He was looking at the face of the woman he had passed in the hallway of his own hospital 47 times without knowing what she knew. His hand, when he reached for his phone, was not steady. Called his attorney first. Not his office line, the personal social number, the one that went to the man's cell phone regardless of hour, which was the number you called when the thing happening was not the kind of thing you routed through assistance. The attorney, a silver-haired partner at a firm in Alexandria that specialized in defense contractor litigation, answered on the third ring with the particular alert blankness of someone who had trained themselves to sound awake. I need to know the current classification status of the Kilo 7 inquiry, Fitch said. No greeting, no preamble. A pause. Gerald, current status. How fast can you get it? That file has been in review for declassification. Partial release was approved in August, I believe. Why are you... Which sections were released? Another pause, this one with a different texture. I'd need to pull the specifics. But the contracting chain documentation, Gerald, that section was flagged for continued protection. It should still be sealed. Should be, Fitch said. Is there a reason you're asking tonight? Fitch looked at the photograph on his screen. The woman in it was younger government ID photos, always flattened people. Washed out what made them specific. But the structure of the face was the same. He had walked past her in his own hallway. He had received her employment application 14 months before he took the director position, rubber stamped by the previous director, buried in a stack of routine hires. He had never looked at the photo. There's a contractor file that surfaced through an active federal inquiry, he said. It was attached to a debrief request submitted today by a patient currently in my hospital. He kept his voice level because leveling his voice was something he had practiced for 23 years in rooms, where the alternative was costly. I need to know whether the contractor's record contains any reference to the logistics chain from kilos to 7. The silence on the other end was long enough to tell him the attorney understood exactly what he was asking and exactly why. I'll make calls, the attorney said. But Gerald, if there's an active federal inquiry touching that file, any contact with the archive looks like... I know what it looks like, Fitch said. Make the calls. He ended the call and sat in the quiet of his office with the photograph on the screen and the particular cold clarity of a man who has just identified a threat and is calculating how much time he has. Not much, was his assessment, but possibly enough. Nora spoke for 1 hour and 40 minutes. She did not use notes. She did not pause for long or backtrack or hedge the way people did when they were constructing a version rather than remembering one. She spoke in the sequential, detail-specific manner of someone who had replayed the events enough times that they existed in her memory as discrete and ordered, not processed into narrative, but still raw, each piece with its own weight. She told Hartwell her real name, Sergeant First Class Adrian Voss U. Army, assigned to a special operations support detachment under a contractor arrangement that had been designed, she had understood at the time, to give the unit flexibility in personnel composition that standard military staffing did not allow. She told her about the Kilo 7 operation, the objective, which she was not certain she could legally name, and so described by function, and the composition of the unit and the intelligence package they had been given before insertion. The package had specified 2 target structures in a narrow valley, in a location she would let Hartwell determine from the coordinates she had memorized and never written down. She told her about the discrepancy she had noticed in the targeting data 48 hours before insertion, reviewing the package in the way she reviewed everything, because it was her nature and her training to read every document in front of her like it might matter. The coordinates for one of the structures had been inconsistent with the imagery data by a margin that could have been a grid error, but felt like something else. She had flagged it. The flag had been received by a logistics coordinator. She had never met in person someone working from the contracting side of the operation, and she had been told the imagery was current and the package was confirmed. She told Hartwell about the valley. 12 hours on the ground. 2 operators down in the first hour, stabilized through the night in a dried creek bed, with 1 working medkit and no medevac, because the weather had closed. And also, she had come to believe later, because someone with authority over the extraction timeline had not moved as quickly as they should have. The airstrike on the 3rd structure, the one that had not been in the package, had come at hour 9. She had heard it from 3 kilometers away. She had known, in the specific immediate way you knew things on the ground, when the intelligence picture had already shown you one anomaly, that it was not supposed to happen. She told Hartwell that when she returned from the extraction and submitted her after-action documentation, she had included a formal notation of the targeting data discrepancy. That notation had been received, logged, and then, as she discovered during the inquiry, when she was given partial access to the documentation, removed from the file before the inquiry board reviewed it. She told Hartwell the name of the logistics coordinator who had received her original flag. Hartwell, who had not interrupted once, looked down at the recorder and then up. "How certain are you of that name?" she asked. "Certain," Nora said. "I have a specific memory of people whose decisions get others killed." Hartwell wrote the name down on a pad that had been blank until then. "And this person, do you know where they are now?" Solus might. Hartwell tapped the pen once against the pad. It was the first uncontrolled movement she had made in almost 2 hours. "Voss," she said, using the name with the deliberate care of someone trying it on. "When you left after the inquiry, why didn't you go through official channels?" "There was a finding." "The finding cleared the unit," Nora said. "It didn't address the removed notation. It didn't address the targeting discrepancy. It said the failure was systemic, which was true in the way that a building fire is systemic. It doesn't tell you who removed the smoke detector." She paused. "I left because I had no way to prove what I believed, and because the people who did have access to that proof were the same people being protected by the classification structure, and because stopped." "Because," Hartwell said. "Because 2 civilians died in that airstrike," Nora said. "And I had flagged the discrepancy that could have prevented it, and the flag was removed, and the inquiry found systemic failure, and I received a formal clearance document and a note thanking me for my service." She looked at Hartwell directly. "I didn't know what to do with that, so I left." The recorder hummed quietly between them. "I know what I'm asking you to do with it now," Hartwell said. "Yes," Nora said. "I know you do." It was past 8 when Nora left the conference room, and the administrative floor was mostly empty, the day shift support staff gone, the executive wing quiet behind its glass walls. She walked the length of the hall toward the elevator, and as she passed the door of Fitch's office, she noticed that the light inside was off. He had been there until at least 6 most days since she had started. She knew this the way she knew the patterns of the building, not by paying attention to him specifically, but by absorbing the rhythms of the space. He had left early. She stood at the elevator and thought about that. The elevator arrived and she stepped in and pressed the button for the parking level. And as the doors closed, she made herself run through the logic plainly and without the emotional distortion that urgency could introduce. Fitch had seen the file. He had made calls, of course he had. That was the predictable first move. Those calls would tell him the status of the classification level, and if the archive section had been partially released, he would know his exposure was real. From there, the practical next move was not legal, not yet, not until he understood the exact shape of the threat. Practical next move was information control. He would look for leverage. She was the leverage. The parking level was cold and half empty, and her footsteps sounded too loud. She walked to her car and sat in it without starting it, phone in hand, and called Solis. He picked up immediately. Fitch left the building at 7:40, she said, earlier than his pattern. A pause. I know we had eyes on the building. Then you know he's moving. He made 2 calls from his office before he left. His attorney and Solis paused. Someone in the Defense Department Logistics Division. Tired, technically. Still connected. The logistics coordinator. She knew it before he said the name, and when he said it, she recognized it and confirmed that her memory and Hartwell's notepad were about to intersect. He's building a containment response, she said. Yes. How much time do I have before he identifies me by name? He may already have it, Solis said. The contractor file cross-reference that surfaced today included your photograph. If he's run your current employment photo against it, he let that finish itself. Then he already knows. We don't know what he knows. But we should assume. I always assume the worst case, she said. Keeps things simple. She ended the call and started the car. She was back at the hospital by 7 the next morning, an hour earlier than her shift, carrying the particular kind of exhausted alertness that came from 4 hours of fragmented sleep and a mind that had refused to fully disengage. The night had been useful in the way that sleepless nights sometimes were not restorative, but productive. The hours spent running through variables and contingencies until the shape of the situation had resolved into something she could hold. Pam Gorecki was already at the nursing station. She looked up when Nora came in, started to say something routine, and then stopped. What happened? Pam said. What do you mean? You look like someone who's been up all night, making a very large decision. Nora put her bag in the locker. I need you to do something for me, she said, turning around. If Fitch calls down to the floor this morning or sends anyone from administration, I need to know immediately, before they reach me. Pam was very still. Nora, can you do that? A long moment. Yes, Pam said. But you need to tell me what's going on. Not yet, Nora said. Soon. She went to check on her first patient, a 43-year-old post-operative cardiac case who was managing his recovery with the anxious compliance of someone who had genuinely frightened himself and spent 20 minutes with him adjusting his pain management and listening to him talk about his daughter's soccer tournament he was afraid he would miss. She listened with actual attention, not performed attention, because he was a person who needed to be listened to, and she was capable of being present to that, even inside a morning that felt like standing on a surface that might shift. That was the part she had never been able to explain to the people who asked how she stayed calm. Depression. It was more that she had learned to hold multiple things at once: the immediate patient, the background situation, the next required action in parallel tracks that did not contaminate each other. It was a skill, not a gift. She had built it over years in conditions that required it. At 9:15, her phone buzzed. Pam's extension. She was in the hallway outside room 6. She answered. Administration, Pam said quietly. Fitch's assistant just called down. He wants to see you in his office at 9:30. 10 minutes. Thank you, she said, and hung up. She stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the middle distance, and then walked to the elevator. Fitch's assistant, a young man named Trevor, who had the energy of someone who had recently discovered that his proximity to authority was a form of currency, told her to go in with the slightly elevated manner of someone delivering news they considered significant. She did not knock. She pushed the door and walked in. Fitch was behind his desk, which was large in the specific way of desks that were purchased to be large. He was 60, or close to it, silver-haired, well-maintained, the kind of physical presentation that came from decades of understanding that appearance was a form of credibility in the rooms he occupied. He had the face of a man who was accustomed to controlling the temperature of his expressions and was currently working to maintain that control against something that was making it difficult. He did not invite her to sit. She sat. Ms. Callahan, he said. Dr. Fitch. He looked at her for a moment with the specific quality of attention that was really assessment cataloging, comparing the mental process of matching the person in front of you to the version you'd built in their absence. Then I'll be direct with you. Please, she said. Cross-reference was generated yesterday through a federal inquiry process. It flagged a contractor file that has a connection to this facility. He kept his voice measured and even the practiced register of executive communication designed to convey control of facts. I have reason to believe that file is connected to you. She said nothing. I also have a protocol violation report on my desk from Dr. Cook, he continued, documenting an unauthorized invasive procedure performed by you during yesterday's incident. He leaned forward slightly. I want to give you an opportunity to speak to both of these things before I make any formal decisions. It was, she noted, beautifully structured. The offer of an opportunity that was actually the application of pressure. Pairing of the security issue with the protocol violation, which linked her professional legitimacy to her cooperativeness. Framing of formal decisions as something he had the authority to withhold as a courtesy, which was precisely backwards. The protocol violation was for hospital administration, and the federal inquiry was entirely outside his jurisdiction. He was smart. She had not underestimated that. The protocol violation, she said, is currently part of an active federal inquiry record. Any formal administrative action related to yesterday's incident will need to be coordinated with the investigating authority before it can proceed. She held his gaze. I'm sure your legal team can confirm that. A barely perceptible tightening around his eyes. The inquiry is about the shooting incident. The protocol report is an internal HR matter. The inquiry is about everything that happened at yesterday's event, she said, including the medical response. I gave a recorded statement to the lead investigator last night. She paused. 3 hours of it. The tightening was more visible now. His hands, folded on the desk, shifted slightly. 3 hours, he said. It was a thorough debrief. The silence that followed was the kind that had pressure in it. She could see him recalculating the timeline, what she might have said, what Hartwell would do with it, how fast his attorney's calls had moved versus how fast the investigation had moved. The math was not resolving in his favor, and he was arriving at that conclusion in real time. Miss Callahan, he said, and then stopped. Voss, she said. The word sat on the desk between them, like an object he hadn't expected to find there. His face did the thing that faces did when a truth landed that confirmed a fear not shock, because he had been afraid of exactly this, but the specific collapse of the distance between fear and fact. Composure remained, technically. The infrastructure of it held. But something underneath had shifted, and they both knew it. My name is Adrian Voss, she said. Sergeant First Class U.S. Army, retired. I was attached to the logistics support chain for Operation Kilo 7 as a combat medical contractor. She kept her voice completely flat. Not angry, not triumphant, just precise. I flagged a targeting data discrepancy 48 hours before insertion. That flag was received by a logistics coordinator in the contracting chain and was subsequently removed from the inquiry documentation. She paused. I told Major Hartwell the name of that coordinator last night. I also gave her the original coordinates from memory, which will be cross-referenced against the archive data when the relevant classification section is formally subpoenaed. Fitch said nothing. The airstrike that killed 2 civilians was not a random intelligence failure, she said. The targeting discrepancy I flagged pointed to a structural conflict in the contractic objective, a conflict that would have exposed certain contracting positions to serious review if the operation had succeeded as planned. She looked at him. I believe you know which positions I'm referring to. The room was very quiet. You have no proof, he said. His voice had changed, still controlled, but the register was different now. Lower. The executive tone had been replaced by something older and less polished. I have a memory, she said. That has been consistent for 6 years. And I have a name on record with a federal investigator. And I have a formally submitted debrief request from Chief Petty Officer Marsh that has already made the contractor file visible to people with the access level to pursue it. She stood. What I don't have is a reason to be in your office right now. She walked to the door. Callahan. He used the wrong name not as a mistake, she thought, but as a last attempt to define what she was in the terms he had been comfortable with. If you walk out of this office, I will pursue the protocol violation through every available channel. She turned around, just slightly, enough to look at him over her shoulder. Document it, she said. It was the same thing she had said to Cook 2 days ago, and it meant exactly the same thing. She walked out. Trevor looked up from his desk with his currency-adjacent expression, and she moved past him without stopping, down the hall to the elevator, and stood inside it, breathing carefully as it descended. Her hands were not shaking, but it was closer than it had been yesterday. Hartwell called at 10:40. "I need you to come in," she said. "No greeting now. I'm on shift. I'm aware. I've spoken to your nursing director. You're being temporarily released for the duration of a formal federal interview." A pause. "This isn't optional, Voss." It was the first time Hartwell had used that name voluntarily, without being prompted. Something about it landed differently than she expected, not uncomfortable, more like putting on something she had not worn in a long time and finding it still fit. "What happened?" Nora asked. The archive section came through. Partial declassification was broader than Fitch's attorney told him last night. Her voice was contained, but there was something moving underneath it, not excitement exactly, but the particular energy of an investigation that has just changed shape. "The logistics coordinator, you named, she's in there. Not as a footnote, as a decision maker." "And Fitch?" Pause. "He's in there too." The elevator had reached the ground floor. The doors opened. She stood in them as they began to close and put her hand out to stop them. "How directly?" she asked. "Directly enough," Hartwell said, "that I have 2 additional investigators arriving from D.C. this afternoon, and a formal subpoena for Hargrove's administrative records going out within the hour. A beat. He doesn't know yet. He will soon. Yes. Which is why I need you in my building in the next 30 minutes, because once he knows, he'll move," Nora said. "He'll move," Hartwell confirmed. She stepped out of the elevator and walked toward the main entrance, and the cold November air hit her face when the doors opened. And for a moment she stood on the threshold between the building and the outside world and felt the specific, disorienting sensation of a situation that had been moving slowly for 6 years beginning, suddenly and without ceremony, to move fast. She had wanted this. She had wanted it the way you wanted things that you had decided were impossible, with a compartmentalized, theoretical longing that you kept carefully separate from your actual daily life, because letting it get close hurt too much. She walked to her car. The formal interview took 3 hours. 2 investigators she hadn't met before. Hartwell, a JAG officer who had arrived from somewhere and said almost nothing, and a court reporter who typed continuously and efficiently and had the professional neutrality of furniture. She went through everything again. Not 3 hours of new information. The interview was structured around the archive documents that had been declassified that morning, pulling her testimony forward and backward against the paper record, finding the places where her memory and the documentation aligned, and noting them, finding the gaps, asking her to account for the gaps. The gaps, mostly, were where the removed notation had been. The investigators had the original flag she had submitted, not the version in the file, which had been excised, but the original, which existed in a backup archive that had been maintained by a different contracting entity and had not been subject to the same document management system. Someone in that backup archive had been thorough, without knowing why it mattered, and the record had survived. When Hartwell put the document on the table in front of her, Nora looked at it for a long time. It was her handwriting. The header, the date, the coordinates, the specific language of the discrepancy. Notice her language. Her formatting, the particular way she structured technical documentation. She had written it at a folding table in a forward operating base with bad lighting and a pen that kept running dry. And she could remember the exact quality of the air in that room and the noise outside and the certainty she had felt, putting those words on paper, that they mattered. "This is yours?" one of the investigators asked. "Yes," she said. "And this notation at the bottom, this routing mark, where was this sent?" "To the logistics coordinator I named last night." She was the operations interface between the unit and the contracting chain. She pointed to the routing mark. "This would have been received by her within 24 hours, and in the file submitted to the inquiry board." "It's not there," she said. "I know. I was given partial access to the inquiry documentation during the proceedings. I looked for it." She looked at the investigators. It wasn't there. The JAG officer wrote something down. The investigation was consolidating. She could feel it in the room, the particular gravity of a proceeding that was moving from predicate to substance, from "there may be something here" to "here it is." 2:15, Hartwell called a recess and walked Nora out to the hallway. "Fitch has retained additional counsel," she said. "He's been advised of the subpoena." How did he take it? His attorney filed an emergency motion to challenge the scope within 45 minutes of service. Hartwell said it without inflection, the way you described weather. "It will be denied. But it buys him time to organize." She looked at Nora. "He also, and this is what I want you to know, he also contacted Dr. Cook this morning, before the subpoena. Nora was very still. What did he tell him? We don't have the full content. But Cook called the state nursing board at 11 a.m. and filed a formal complaint regarding your credentials and scope of practice. Hartwell's voice remained even. He specifically referenced your military background as grounds for questioning whether your nursing certification was obtained through legitimate channels. The hallway was bright and institutional and completely indifferent. He's trying to pull my license, Nora said. He's trying to create a public record that precedes whatever comes next, Hartwell said. If he can establish that you're professionally compromised before the investigation becomes public, it changes the narrative. I know what it does, Voss, Hartwell said it quietly. We can protect the investigation. We cannot necessarily protect your employment here in the short term. Fitch has administrative authority over this facility, and while he cannot directly violate the federal inquiry, he has tools that are technically within his purview. He's going to suspend me, Nora said. I think he's going to try. The fluorescent light above them buzzed once and steadied. When? She asked. His assistant has been trying to reach you since noon. Hartwell looked at her watch. He has a hospital board member on the phone. He's building the documentation for an emergency administrative suspension. Pending review of the protocol violation. The suspension would remove her building access. It would separate her from Marsh, from Pam, from the floor, from the physical proximity to the investigation that had been, she now understood, the thing Fitch had identified as her advantage. How long do we have? She asked. The board member has to sign off. That usually, Hartwell's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Her expression did not change, but something behind it shifted. What? Nora said. Marsh, Hartwell said. He's called a formal witness protection request through his chain of command. He's claiming that, as the primary material witness to the incident, he requires direct access to the medical personnel who treated him. She looked up. Not standard procedure. It's barely a real mechanism. But it creates a complication for the suspension because it links your presence in the building to a military witness protection claim that Fitch doesn't have authority to override. Marsh did that, Nora said. Filed it 11 minutes ago. His commanding officer countersigned from a naval hospital in Maryland. Hartwell looked at her with something that was not quite admiration, but was in the same county. He's been making calls all morning. From somewhere down the hall came the sound of a door, opening, the specific, weighted sound of a large door with a hydraulic closer, the kind on the stairwell that accessed the executive floor. Both of them turned. Dr. Gerald Fitch was walking toward them with his attorney on one side, and Trevor 3 steps behind, carrying a manila folder with the slightly dazed expression of a man who had not been told what was in it. Stopped 6 feet away. He looked at Hartwell. Then he looked at Nora. And in the 3 seconds of silence before anyone spoke, Nora saw something in his face that she recognized from the valley, not guilt, not fear exactly, but the specific expression of a person whose calculations have just run out of room and who is arriving, in real time, at the understanding that the thing they had been managing for years has stopped being manageable. Then his attorney put a hand on his arm and leaned in and said something quietly, and Fitch's expression reorganized itself into the practiced blankness of a man who had just been told to stop talking. Major Hartwell, the attorney said, my client needs to speak with you privately. My interview is ongoing, Hartwell said pleasantly. Time sensitive. So is mine. She looked at Fitch, not the attorney. Fitch, you'll receive formal communication from my office within the hour regarding the scope of the subpoena. I'd suggest you respond through counsel. She turned back to Nora. Go back inside. She put her hand on the conference room door. And Fitch said quietly, not to Hartwell, but to Nora, in the tone of a man speaking past the situation into something older and more direct. You have no idea what you've put in motion. She turned and looked at him one final time. Flagged a discrepancy, she said. 6 years ago. Piece of paper. In a room with bad lighting. She held his gaze. You removed it. That's what put this in motion. She walked back into the conference room. The door closed behind her. And in the parking structure below, in a gray sedan that had been there since 7 a.m., a man who was not Warren Solis and was not connected to Hartwell's office was sitting with a phone pressed to his ear, reporting to someone on the other end that the situation had escalated beyond the parameters they had been given, and asking for instruction. The person on the other end told him to wait, and then told him something else, and the man in the sedan started his engine. The man in the sedan sat for 4 minutes after the call ended. He was not a dramatic person by nature. Drama was expensive, and he had learned early that expensive habits reduced your operational lifespan. He was methodical. He ran threat assessments, the way other people ran grocery lists, quickly, in order, without sentiment. The assessment he was running now was telling him that the situation in the building above him had crossed a threshold that his original instruction set had not accounted for, and that the person who had given him those instructions had just told him to do something that his methodical nature recognized as both necessary and very likely to make things significantly worse. He put the car in reverse anyway. Because that was the other thing about being methodical, you did what the job required, and you made your objections known afterward, in writing, to the appropriate party. He pulled out of the parking structure and drove north. Inside the conference room, Nora spent another 40 minutes with the investigators working through the logistics chain documentation, the specific architecture of contracted relationships that had governed the Kilo 7 operation, paper trail of authorizations and sign-offs that the declassified archives section had finally made readable. The JAG officer had become more active in the last hour, asking technical questions about contracting structures that revealed a familiarity with how these arrangements worked from the inside. The picture that was assembling itself across the table was not complicated, exactly. It was dense, the deliberate density of systems designed to distribute accountability so thoroughly that pinning it to any individual required the kind of sustained documentary effort that most inquiries didn't have the mandate or the patience for. This inquiry, as of this morning, had both. At 3:45, Hartwell called another recess and stepped out to take a call. She was gone for 12 minutes. When she came back, she sat down and put both hands flat on the table and looked at Nora with the expression of someone about to deliver information that was going to require a response. "The nursing board complaint Cook filed this morning," she said. "It was reviewed for expedited processing on the grounds that you're currently involved in an active federal proceeding." "That's backwards," Nora said. "Active federal proceedings should pause ancillary complaint discussion." "Normally, yes." "The board received a letter from an attorney, not Fitch's attorney, a different one arguing that the federal proceeding itself was predicated on your testimony, which is compromised if your professional credentials are in question. The letter requested that the board review your original nursing certification records before the investigation reaches its evidentiary phase." Hartwell paused. The letter was filed 8 this morning. Before the archive section came through, before the subpoena, Nora was very still. "Someone planned this before today," she said. "Timing is yes. It suggests coordination that predates this morning's developments." Hartwell's voice was even. "Fitch did not write that letter. His attorney did not write it. The firm on the letterhead is out of Richmond and has no visible connection to Fitch or to the Kilo 7 contracting structure." She looked at her notes. "But the firm does have a documented relationship with a defense logistics company that appears 3 times in the archive documents we reviewed this morning. The table between them was covered in paper now organized, tabbed, cross-referenced. The shape of a conspiracy was not dramatic when you laid it out in documents. It looked like administrative work. It looked like the natural sediment of institutional process. That was, she had come to understand the point. "He's not alone," Nora said. "No," Hartwell said. "He's not. The logistics coordinator I named, she's connected to that firm?" "Confirming. But the initial review suggests us, yes." Hartwell looked at her. "Voss, I need to ask you something directly." "Ask." "During the original inquiry, you were given partial access to the documentation. You reviewed what was there and noted the absence of your notation." She paused. "Did you retain any copies of original documentation from the operation? Anything you kept privately?" Nora considered the question in the careful way of someone who understood exactly what it meant to answer it. "No," she said. "I operated under the assumption that retaining documentation would create legal exposure. That was the correct assumption." Hartwell held her gaze. But what? "But you memorized the coordinates. You memorized the name of the logistics coordinator. You gave me both with specificity that matched the archive exactly." She was quiet for a moment. "What else do you remember?" The room was very quiet. "Everything," Nora said. "I remember everything." Hartwell picked up her pen. "Then let's use it." They worked for another 2 hours. Nora pulled from memory the details of the pre-insertion briefing, the specific language used to characterize the intelligence package, the name of the document series it had been formatted under, the authorization codes she had seen at the top of the targeting data. She had not known at the time that she was memorizing them. She had read them with the automatic thoroughness of someone who processed information in a particular, and they had stayed. The way things stayed when your brain had decided they were important before your conscious mind caught up. The investigators checked each item against the archive as she gave it. 7 of the first 9 matched exactly. The 8th was a partial match. The authorization code had been modified in the filed version. A single digit changed, which was either a transcription error or something else. The 9th was not in the archive at all, which meant it was either in the still classified portion or it had been removed. When she named the document series, the JAG officer looked up from his pad for the first time in 40 minutes and said, "That series was discontinued in the year following Kilo 7. The official reason given was administrative restructuring." "When was that decision made?" Hartwell asked. He checked something on his laptop. 4 months after the inquiry finding was filed. Hartwell wrote that down without comment. Nora looked at the table of papers, the archive printouts, the pad with Hartwell's precise handwriting, covering 3/4 of its pages. 6 years. 6 years of this existing in the sediment of classified files and backup archives and the unshared memories of people who had been in a valley in bad weather. And now it was here on a table in a federal building outside Crestford, Virginia, being assembled by a military investigator with 2 cups of cold coffee and a JAG officer who had stopped pretending to be furniture. She felt something she did not have a clean word for. Not relief. Not vindication. That word had always seemed too clean for anything real. More like the specific exhaustion of holding a weight for so long that when you finally set it down, you don't feel lighter immediately. You just feel the absence of the effort. At 6 p.m., Hartwell's phone buzzed 4 times in rapid succession. She looked at it, and Nora watched her read whatever was there. Fitch's emergency suspension request, Hartwell said, was denied by the hospital board 40 minutes ago. Nora did not say anything. Marsh's witness protection claim created enough procedural complication that 2 board members abstained and 1 voted no. Without a full majority, it doesn't pass. Hartwell looked at her. Still have building access. For now, Hartwell agreed. There's something else. She turned the phone so Nora could see the screen, a message from one of the investigators who had left an hour earlier to coordinate with Hartwell's D.C. colleagues. The subpoena for the hospital's administrative records was served at 5:30. In addition to the standard scope, it covers communications records, email, phone logs, internal messaging for the last 18 months. She paused. Fitch's assistant is cooperating. Trevor, with his currency-adjacent expression, who had been standing 3 feet from everything. He kept records, Nora said. Apparently Trevor was very thorough about his records, Hartwell said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite dry humor but occupied the neighboring space. He printed and filed physical copies of every communication he processed, including 2 emails from this morning that Fitch sent through a personal account rather than his hospital address, which is in the context of a federal investigation with a known pending subpoena, an interesting choice. He was trying to keep it off the official record. Yes. Unfortunately, Trevor printed those too. Nora thought about Trevor's expression when she had walked past his desk this morning, the elevated manner. She had read it as the performance of proximity to authority, and it had been that, but it had also been something else she hadn't caught at the time. He already knew something was happening, she said. He's been uneasy about Fitch for several months, apparently. He came to the investigators voluntarily this afternoon. Hartwell set the phone down. The emails reference the nursing board complaint and the Richmond law firm. They also reference a conversation Fitch had last night with the retired Defense Department logistics official. She looked directly at Nora. He named a specific outcome he was trying to achieve. He wanted you discredited before the archive documents could be formally entered into evidence. His language was, she checked the phone again. Neutralize the source before the source becomes the record. The word sat in the air. He wrote that, Nora said. He emailed it. At 11:47 p.m. last night. Hartwell's voice had not changed in register, but had gone very precise, the way it did when the information she was delivering was carrying its own weight. Voss, this morning you walked into that man's office and told him your real name, and gave him a direct account of what you had told me. You did that knowing he might move against you. Yes, that forced him to move fast enough to make mistakes. She held her gaze. You knew he would. Nora did not answer immediately. She thought about sitting in her car in the parking structure the night before, counting backward from 10. About the calculations she had run during those 4 hours of fragmented sleep, not just variables and contingencies, but something colder and more deliberate. Fitch was careful when he had time. He had spent 6 years being careful with time. The way to uncareful a careful man was to take his time away. I needed him to move, she said, before Solis's people moved. Before whatever was in motion from that phone call last night had a chance to organize. She paused. If he had 48 hours to coordinate with the Richmond firm and the logistics official and whoever else is in that network, the nursing board complaint becomes a real procedural obstacle. My testimony gets tied up in credential challenges while the archive gets re-challenged through legal motions. The investigation stalls. So you provoked him into rushing. Told him the truth, she said. He rushed on his own. Hartwell was quiet for a moment. That required you to bet that I had moved fast enough overnight that his rushing would catch him, rather than you. I knew you'd moved fast, Nora said. You're the kind that wants to know what actually happened. It was a repetition of what Marsh had said, and Hartwell recognized it. A small acknowledgement crossed her face, before it was absorbed back into her professional composure. All right, Hartwell said. She started organizing the papers on the table with the deliberate efficiency of someone closing one phase and opening the next. Tomorrow morning, the archives section gets formally entered into the investigation record. The subpoena returns on the administrative records are being processed overnight. I have a meeting at 7 a.m. with my superiors in D.C., at which point the investigation formally expands in scope. She stacked the last of the papers. What that means for you is that your testimony is now part of an evidentiary record that is very difficult to challenge retroactively. The nursing board complaint will receive a federal hold within 24 hours. She looked up. You should sleep tonight. I'll try, Nora said. I mean it. Tomorrow is going to be longer than today. She drove back to her apartment through streets that were ordinary traffic lights, a gas station, 2 people walking a dog in the cold. The normalcy of the outside world after the compression of the conference room had the specific quality of surfacing from water. Everything was louder and flatter simultaneously. She ate something she did not taste. She sat on the couch in the apartment with nothing on the walls and thought about Marsh making phone calls from a hospital bed with a chest tube, and Trevor's organized filing system, and the backup archive that had survived because some unnamed contracting entity had been thorough without knowing why it mattered. The things that saved you were rarely the things you planned. She was asleep by 9:30, which was earlier than she had slept in months. The morning arrived with the particular clarity of a cold November day. After a hard frost, everything sharp-edged, the sky an unambiguous blue. She was at the hospital by 7, moving through her shift with the slightly suspended quality of someone operating on one track, while another track underneath was running its own parallel process. 9 a.m., she heard about Cook. Not from Pam, from Marcus Webb, the 26-year-old who was raw and who therefore spoke before he had fully considered what he was saying, which was occasionally useful. Cook got called to administration this morning, Marcus said, appearing at her elbow while she was updating a chart. Immediately called. They were waiting for him when he came in. Okay, she said. Sheila said it's about the protocol report he filed. Something about the federal inquiry. He paused. Is that about what happened Saturday? Yes, she said. Are you in trouble? She looked at him. He was genuinely asking, not performing concern, actually uncertain and a little worried in the way of someone who had watched things happen over the past 3 days without having enough context to understand them. No, she said. Not anymore. He looked like he wanted to ask more. She handed him the chart and walked to the next room. What happened to Cook was not immediate. It did not happen the way it happened in stories, where consequence was swift and visible and satisfying in its timing. It happened the way institutional accountability happened, when it actually happened, slowly, with documentation, through channels that were boring to observe and difficult to interrupt. But it happened. The protocol report he had filed, the careful, policy-coded document he had built on the premise that the procedure Nora had performed was a liability risks, regardless of outcome, was reviewed by the hospital's legal team in the context of the federal subpoena. The legal team, facing the specific situation of having filed an internal document against a person who was now a federal witness in an investigation that included their administrative records, did what legal teams did. They flagged it. re-reviewed it, and noted that the report had been filed within 6 hours of the incident, before any clinical outcome review had been conducted, and that several of the policy citations Cook had used were being applied in ways that other members of the medical staff had already questioned in writing, those writings being among the records Trevor had helpfully preserved. Cook was called to administration. The protocol report was suspended pending review. He was not suspended himself, not yet, not that morning. But the suspension of the report meant the report had no procedural teeth, and without the report, he had no mechanism for the thing he had built the report to achieve. He came to the nursing floor at 11. He walked to the station where Nora was standing with Pam and stopped and looked at her with the expression of a man who had spent 2 days being certain of his position and was now not certain of anything. Committee review has been postponed, he said. I heard, she said. I want you to know that the report was filed in good faith. She looked at him. He was 44 years old, and he was a competent physician. She had assessed that within her first week, the same way she assessed everything. He had filed the report because it was the tool available to him, and because he had spent enough years in an environment that rewarded the assertion of hierarchy that it had become his first move without his fully noticing. He was not Gerald Fitch. He was something smaller and more ordinary, a man who had confused authority with knowledge and had used his authority against someone he had never actually looked at. All right, she said. He waited as if she might say more. She didn't. After a moment, he walked back toward the elevator. Pam waited until he was gone. That's it? That's it, Nora said. He filed a complaint with the state nursing board. That's being addressed. Pam looked at her for a long moment with the expression she'd had since Saturday, the expression of someone continuously revising an assessment upward. Who are you? She asked. Not hostility, genuine curiosity, the kind that had waited 3 days to ask. I'm the nurse on this floor, Nora said. I have 2 patients who need afternoon vitals. Pam almost smiled. It was a complicated, almost smile, the kind that acknowledged something that was not going to be explained right now, and had decided that was acceptable. Fitch resigned at 2 p.m. It was not announced to the staff. Immediately it went to the board first, and the board's communications process was what it was. Pam had a source on the administrative floor, which was Trevor, who was apparently texting from his desk with the energy of someone who had found a new use for his filing instincts, and the information arrived on the nursing floor at 2:40 via the extremely efficient informal network of a hospital that had been operating under a complicated director for 14 months. Nora was in a patient room when Pam came to find her. She stepped into the hallway. Pam told her. She nodded. Was it voluntary? She asked. Trevor says the board told him this morning that they couldn't protect the position given the scope of the federal record. He submitted the letter at 1:45. Voluntary in the way that things were voluntary when the alternative was worse. What about the criminal side? That's federal. That doesn't go through the board. Pam paused. It's going to take longer. I know. She did know. The criminal process would take months. The formal charging, the proceedings, the long grind of institutional accountability. That was nothing like the clean narrative version. Fitch would have lawyers who were very good at the long grind. The logistics coordinator, whose name Nora had given Hartwell, would have lawyers too. The man in the gray sedan, whoever he was a variable she still didn't fully understand. The record existed now. It was entered. It could not be unentered. You're not satisfied, Pam said, reading her. I'm not unsatisfied, Nora said. I just know what resigned means and what it doesn't mean. It means he's out of this building. Yes, she said. Does mean. At 4 p.m. she went up to the 3rd floor. Marsh was sitting up more than he should have been, the drainage tube now removed, the monitors reduced to a single pulse oximeter. He had been moved from acute recovery to a standard room, which meant he was healing faster than the optimistic end of the projection. He had the particular restlessness of a man whose body was ahead of the schedule his mind had been given. Fitch resigned, he said when she came in. I know. Trevor sent me a text. She looked at him. You have Trevor's number? I have a lot of numbers. He said it without apology. Solis told me about the emails, the neutralize the source email. He looked at her steadily. That's criminal obstruction. On top of everything else. One count of many, she said. The process is going to be long. I know how long these things are. He shifted, and the wince was smaller than yesterday, the intercostal nerves settling into their new geography. Hartwell's briefing in D.C. went well this morning. The investigation scope was approved. He paused. You're listed as a cooperating witness with protected status. The nursing board hold was filed at 10 a.m. She sat in the chair. You've been busy for someone with a healing thoracic cavity. I make calls, he said. It's what I do when I can't do other things. He looked at her. How are you? She thought about the question. It was the kind of question she had become accustomed to fielding as a deflection opportunity, a space to say fine and move on. But Marsh asked things with the specific directness of a man who had spent his career in situations where accurate information mattered and had never fully turned that off, and she had run out of fine somewhere around hour 2 of last night's interview. I'm tired, she said. Yeah, he said. That makes sense. She stopped, looked at her hands. I don't know what the right word is. I thought I would feel something more specific by now. What? Like finished. She looked up. It doesn't feel finished. It's not finished, he said. It's going to be a long time before it's finished. Process. The proceedings, it's all going to keep going. I know. But the part where you were alone with it, he said, and the record didn't exist, and the people responsible were protected by the structure, that part is finished. He held her gaze. That part ended when you pressed the record button. She was quiet for a moment. Your commanding officer countersigned the witness protection claim from Maryland, she said. He didn't ask questions. He asked one question. Marsh paused. He asked if she was worth it. What did you tell him? I told him the last time someone made a call like this. For my unit, 2 men came home who shouldn't have. He looked at her steadily. He signed it. Outside the window, the November light was going the short days of early winter, doing their efficient work, pulling the blue out of the sky, and replacing it with the gray-orange of a campus with too many security lights. She had watched this window at different hours over the past 2 years from the floor below. In the particular unfocused way you looked at things when your hands were busy and your mind was on something else. She had never thought she would be watching from here. Solis came to see me this morning, Marsh said, changing register slightly. Before the briefing. What did he want? He wanted to tell me something about the man in the parking structure. He said it plainly, watching her face. The sedan. You knew about the sedan. Hartwell mentioned it. They ran the plates. The plates came back to a shell company connected to the Richmond firm. He paused. The man who was driving it is someone named Garrett Vane, former DoD contractor, specialty in his words, sensitive information management. He looked at her, which means he manages people and situations that need to disappear quietly. The room's single monitor beeped steadily. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was looking at Marsh with the particular quality of stillness she went to when something required her full attention and no visible response. He left the parking structure yesterday afternoon, she said. He did, and Solis lost him. Marsh's voice was even. For about 6 hours. He was located this morning at a motel 12 miles from here. He held her gaze. Voss, whatever Fitch's network sent him here to do, Fitch's resignation doesn't necessarily end his instruction set. These arrangements aren't called off by the person who set them in motion once that person becomes legally exposed. Called off by whoever is actually running the coordination, logistics coordinator, or someone above her. He paused. Solis's people at the motel. But Vane as he stopped. Phone buzzed. She looked at it. Hartwell's number, she answered. Where are you? Hartwell said. 3rd floor. Marsh's room. Don't leave the building. Her voice had the specific compression of someone who was managing their delivery carefully. Vane left the motel at 3:15. We don't have his current location. A pause. The nursing board received a second communication this afternoon. From Cook. From a party we haven't fully identified. It included documentation we have not been able to source personnel records that appear to be from your military file, Voss. Records that don't match the version in the archive. She was very still. They've been altered, Hartwell said. Someone produced a version of your service record that contradicts your testimony. It was submitted to the nursing board as evidence that your military background is inconsistent with your stated qualifications. A pause. And it was submitted to a journalist. Which journalist? Fence Beat. National publication. The story goes live tomorrow morning unless we get a hold. The monitor beeped. Marsh was watching her face, with the expression of a man reading a situation he had not been told the details of, and was constructing from what he could see. Can you get the hold? She asked. We're working on it. But Voss, if the story runs before the investigation enters its public phase, the altered records become the first version people see. Corrections don't travel as far as the original. She knew that. She had known it the moment Hartwell said journalist. The architecture of it was clear. Fitch's resignation had closed one door, and whoever was coordinating above him had immediately opened another. They couldn't discredit her through the nursing board anymore. The federal hold would block that. They couldn't use the protocol report. They couldn't use administrative suspension. So they had gone outside the institutional structure entirely, to a space where the investigation's protective mechanisms did not reach. Story with altered records. Published before the archive documents were public. Sourced from documentation that looked official and would take days to formally refute. Garrett Vane, who managed things that needed to disappear quietly, had not come to Crestford to do something physical. He had come to deliver something to someone documentation, she now understood, that had been prepared in advance, against the possibility that the institutional avenues failed, which meant this had been planned longer than she had realized. And Vane was still out there, somewhere in the 12 miles, between that motel and this building, and he had already delivered what he came to deliver, and the only question now was what else he had been given to do if the delivery wasn't enough. Her phone buzzed again. Different number. She looked at it. Unknown. Government prefix. But not Hartwell's office. She looked at Marsh. He read her face. Answer it, he said. The voice on the other end was not Solus. It was a woman she had never spoken to, unhurried, with the specific cadence of someone who communicated in structures rather than sentences. Sergeant Voss, the woman said. My name is irrelevant. What's relevant is that I'm the person Garrett Vane reports to, and I'm calling to tell you that his current instructions are being recalled. A pause. This is a courtesy call. I want you to understand that what's happening is not personal. Nora's jaw was tight. She made it loosen. What is it then? It's the management of a situation that got away from the people managing it. The voice was steady, completely, infuriatingly steady. The documentation submitted to the journalist was a mistake. It was not authorized at my level. But it's already submitted. Yes. And you're calling me instead of Hartwell. A pause. I'm calling you because you're the one who needs to decide something in the next few hours. The voice did not change. Altered records can be walked back. There are mechanisms. But those mechanisms require a level of cooperation that the investigation in its current form may not be structured to provide. You're asking me to influence the investigation. I'm asking you to understand that the people at the center of this inquiry are not the only people connected to it. Some of those connections go in directions that the inquiry's current scope does not cover. Scope expands. She stopped. Some of what surfaces will be uncomfortable for people who are not Gerald Fitch. Nora stood up from the chair. She moved to the window, turned her back to Marsh, and looked at the darkening sky outside. Who, she said. That's not a conversation for this call. Then we're not having a conversation, she said. We're having a threat. Silence. Walk the records back, Nora said. Contact the journalist through whatever mechanism you have. Recall Vane completely. And then, she paused. Then you can call Hartwell and explains the scope question directly, because that is the only conversation that exists from this point forward. A long pause on the other end. You understand what you're asking, the woman said. Understand exactly what I'm asking, Nora said. And I understand that you called me instead of Hartwell because you thought I would negotiate. I'm telling you I won't. Another pause. Then the line went dead. She stood at the window for a moment. The sky was fully dark now, the orange security lights turning the frost on the grass below into something that looked almost warm. Marsh was behind her, saying nothing, waiting. She turned around. I need to call Hartwell, she said. I know. He was watching her. Who was that? I don't know her name, Nora said. But I know she's above Fitch in the coordination chain, and I know she just told me the scope of what I don't know. She looked at him. The investigation needs to go wider. How much wider? She thought about the woman's voice, the structure of her sentences, the specific framing of uncomfortable for people who are not Gerald Fitch. Careful non-specificity of it, which was itself a form of information. I don't know yet, she said. But she called me instead of cutting her losses, which means cutting her losses isn't an option. She picked up her phone to call Hartwell, which means there's something in that archive that she is more afraid of than she is of this investigation. She dialed. And somewhere in the building below, in the administrative wing that was now operating without its director, in the office with the large desk and the glass walls, the lights were still off, but the computer on the desk had not been logged out. And the session that was open on the screen contained a folder that Gerald Fitch had accessed at 7:43 the previous evening, and had not had time to close. Inside that folder were 47 documents. Hartwell's team would find them in the morning. Hartwell picked up before the first ring finished. "I just received a call," Nora said. "Unknown number. Woman, no name given." She identified herself as the person Garrett Vane reports to. Pause that lasted exactly 2 seconds. "Tell me everything," Nora told her. She stood at the window in Marsh's room and repeated the conversation word for word, because she had the kind of memory that held spoken exchanges the way it held coordinates precisely, in sequence, without editorializing. Hartwell did not interrupt. She heard the sound of a pen on paper approximately 4 times. When Nora finished, Hartwell said, "She called you instead of us." "Yes, which means she believes you have some influence over the direction of the investigation. Or she believes I want something badly enough to trade for it. Do you?" Nora looked at the frost on the grass below the window. "No," she said. "Not from her." "Good." Hartwell's voice had shifted the investigation management register, replaced by something more direct. "The journalist. I need the name of the publication. She didn't give it. We'll find it. Defense Beat. National, there are maybe 12 people who cover that space at the level that would get this kind of access. We'll work the list." A pause. "The folder on Fitch's computer, you said his session was still open?" "I'm inferring. He left quickly yesterday. He's not known for clean digital habits. Trevor mentioned once that IT had flagged his session management. I'm sending someone to that office in the next 20 minutes. Hartwell said it with a compressed efficiency of someone already in motion. "Don't go in there yourself." "I know." And Voss, the woman on the phone. "Her willingness to call you directly, to offer a walkback of the records, that's leverage. She's exposed enough that she's negotiating. Which means whatever is in that archive that she's afraid of, it's real and it's accessible." A pause. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to require you to be present." "You said that yesterday." "I meant it yesterday too." A beat the closest Hartwell came to warmth. "You did the right thing. Not negotiating with her. I want you to know that I know it wasn't easy." Nora looked at Marsh. He was watching her with the patient stillness of someone who had learned to read outcomes from a person's posture before they spoke. "It wasn't hard either," she said, and hung up. She slept 6 hours. It was not good sleep. It was the layered half-conscious kind, where the brain refused to fully release, because it had registered the environment as requiring monitoring. But 6 hours was more than 4. And she woke at 5:30 with the particular clarity that came after the body had decided it had taken what it could get and was done asking for more. She made coffee. She stood at her kitchen counter in the dark and drank it and thought about the woman on the phone. Her voice, the specific architecture of her sentences, the word uncomfortable. People used that word when they meant something stronger and were still trying to preserve negotiating distance. The woman had been afraid, not of Nora specifically, but of the open scope of an investigation that had stopped being controllable. Fear was information. At 6 a.m., Hartwell sent a text. Folder found. 47 documents. You were right about his session. Briefing at 800. 15. A second text. Journalist identified. Hold up requested and granted pending verification of documentation authenticity. Story pulled for now. At 6:22, a third. Vane's instructions, formally recalled per his own statement. Cooperating. Get here by 745. She put the phone down and finished the coffee. The 47 documents in Fitch's folder were not a surprise in their content, they were a surprise in their completeness. People who maintained documentation of their own wrongdoing did so for one reason, because the wrongdoing was collaborative, and they needed the record as insurance against the other collaborators. Fitch had not been protecting himself from the investigation. He had been protecting himself from the network he was part of. The documents covered 9 years. They included communication records, contract authorization chains, financial transfer summaries, and most significantly, a series of internal assessments of operational outcomes in which the language used was the specific, bureaucratic language of people who knew what they were doing and had constructed a paper architecture designed to describe it as something else. The woman who had called Nora appeared in 7 of the documents. Her name was Laurel Stassen. She was not a contractor. She was a serving federal employee in a logistics oversight position that had, over 9 years, given her authority over contracting chains connected to multiple special operations support programs, including the one that had governed Kilo 7. Her name was in Hartwell's briefing by 8:15. A federal arrest warrant was issued for Stassen at 11:40 a.m. on the fourth day, after the ceremony shooting the same day that the Defense Department announced a formal review of contracting procedures connected to the Kilo 7 inquiry, and the same day that the Richmond law firm put out a statement saying they had ceased representing all clients connected to the matter. Nora was in a patient room when Hartwell called to tell her about the warrant. Stepped into the hallway and listened and said very little, because there was very little to say. The warrant was not an ending. It was a formal acknowledgement that what she had known for 6 years was now something the institutional record knew too. Those were different things, and she had stopped expecting them to feel the same. Stassen is in custody, Hartwell said. She was picked up at Dulles at 9 a.m. She had a ticket. Where to? Does it matter? No, Nora said. Suppose it doesn't. Cook came to find her that afternoon. Not in the break room, not in a hallway. He came to the nursing station, where she was standing in full view of the floor, which she understood was deliberate. He had the expression of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say, and was now discovering that rehearsed things sounded rehearsed when you said them to the actual person. He said, "I want to apologize." She waited. The protocol report was I filed it because I thought I was protecting the hospital, and because he stopped. The rehearsed version had run out. Because I didn't know who you were, and I'd already decided who you were, and those are not the same thing, and I knew that, and I did it anyway. He looked at her. Face was doing something uncontrolled that she suspected he was not accustomed to his face doing in professional settings. That's not an excuse. It's what happened. She looked at him for a moment. He was not a villain. She had known that from the beginning, and had found it more complicated than a villain would have been. He was a man who had used the tools available to him against someone he had underestimated, and the tools had failed, and now he was standing in front of her without them. "I know," she said. "I don't expect you to—" "I'm not going to tell you it's fine," she said. "Because you had a wounded man's treating nurse in a complaint process while he was recovering from chest surgery. That's not fine." She held his gaze. "But I also know you didn't know what you were walking into. And I know the report is suspended." She paused. "Let it stay suspended." He nodded. He was not relieved. Exactly, relief would have been too clean. He looked like a person who had been told that the consequences of a decision would not be as severe as they could have been, and who was mature enough to understand that not severe was not the same as none. "I looked up the procedure," he said. "The field decompression, parameters in which it's indicated." He paused. "You made the right call, I know," she said again. He left. Pam materialized from the vicinity of the supply cabinet with the timing of someone who had been listening with professional interest. "You let him off easy," Pam said. "He's a decent physician who made a bad decision," Nora said. "I've made bad decisions. Not like that. Different ones." She picked up the chart she'd been updating. "Every person in this building has used the tools they had against someone they misjudged. The difference is whether they can see it afterward." She looked at Pam. He could see it. "That's not nothing." Pam considered this. "Strange person," she said finally, not unkindly. More like the conclusion of a calculation that had been running for 5 days. "I know," Nora said, and went back to the chart. The formal hearing was 3 weeks later. It was not a trial, not yet. Criminal proceedings against Fitch and Stassen would take considerably longer to reach that stage, but a formal evidentiary hearing before a Defense Department oversight board that had been convened specifically to address the Kilo 7 inquiry findings in light of the new documentation. It was conducted in a federal building in Arlington, in a room that was large and governmental and almost entirely without natural light. And Nora sat at a witness table in civilian clothes and answered questions for 4 hours. She had testified before. She knew how to do it, the measured pace, the precise language, the discipline of answering what was asked, and nothing more, letting the record accumulate rather than trying to build it yourself. She had been afraid, in the weeks leading up to the hearing, that she would feel something unmanageable during it. Anger, maybe, or the accumulated weight of 6 years surfacing at a volume she couldn't keep out of her voice. What she felt instead was tired and very clear. The board had the documents. They had Stassen's own records, which her cooperation agreement had opened, in exchange for a reduced charging recommendation that her attorney had negotiated, and that Nora had no control over, and had decided to accept as the reality of how these things worked. They had the backup archive notation in Nora's handwriting. They had the altered version of her service record that Vane had delivered to the journalist, which had been forensically analyzed and found to have been modified using document management software, traceable to a system Stassen's office had used. They had the original flag she had submitted matched to her memory exactly. The board chair, a woman in her 60s with the bearing of someone who had sat in these rooms for 30 years and had stopped being impressed by anything except accuracy, looked at Nora over her reading glasses at the end of the 4th hour and said, "Sergeant Voss, your original notification of a targeting data discrepancy was received, logged, and subsequently removed from the inquiry documentation. The board's finding will reflect that the systemic failure designation in the original inquiry was incomplete, and that the removal of your notification constituted a deliberate interference with the inquiry process." She paused. "I want to ask you directly, is there anything in the record as it stands today that you believe is still inaccurate or incomplete?" Nora thought about the question. She thought about the 2 houses in the valley, which were not in any document and never would be, because they were not the kind of thing that fit into a record. They existed in the way things existed, that had no formal category present, weighted unchanged by anything that happened in rooms like this one. "No," she said. "The record is accurate. Then this portion of the hearing is concluded." The board chair removed her glasses. "For what it's worth, Sergeant Voss, the board recognizes that you submitted this notification under considerable operational pressure and at personal professional risk, and that you have maintained the accuracy of your account for 6 years without institutional support." She held Nora's gaze with the direct, unsentimental attention of someone who did not say things she did not mean. "That's not a small thing." Nora did not say thank you. She nodded once, and that was all. Marsh was discharged from Hargrove the day before the hearing. He came to find her on the floor before he left in uniform, which surprised her, though it shouldn't have. He was the kind of man who marked transitions with the correct clothing. He looked better than he had any right to look 3 weeks after a through-and-through chest wound and a surgical decompression. The body's capacity for repair, she had always thought, was its most underrated quality, the unsentimental, relentless reassembly of what had been damaged, proceeding without drama or gratitude toward the simple fact of function. "You should still be resting," she said. "I'll rest when it's appropriate to rest. It's appropriate now. It's appropriate after I've done what I came to do." He held out an envelope. It was sealed, official-looking, with a return address that she recognized as Naval Special Warfare Command. "This is a formal commendation for the action at the ceremony." He paused. "And for the 6 years before it." She looked at the envelope. She did not take it immediately. "I didn't do it for commendation." "I know, which is one of the reasons they're giving it." He was still holding it out. "Take it, not because you need it, because the record should say the right thing about you." She took it. It was heavier than it looked. Or maybe that was just her, the weight of a formal document that said something true about who she was, in writing, where it could be found. "Where do you go from here?" she asked. "Medical leave. Then evaluation. Then wherever they send me." He said it with the equanimity of a man who had long ago made his peace with not knowing where he was going next. She looked at the floor around them, the nursing station, the hallway, the doors of rooms she knew the layouts of, the patients inside she knew the charts of, the ordinary, non-dramatic infrastructure of a place where people came to be repaired. "I'm staying," she said. He looked at her. "Here? After everything." "Patients on this floor still need nursing," she said. "Staff here still need training. And there's a gap in trauma response protocols that nobody has addressed, which I've been thinking about for 2 years, and now apparently have the standing to say something about." He was quiet for a moment. "Then you're going to spend your career in a hospital." "I was always going to spend my career in a hospital." She looked at him. "I just had to figure out which one." Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, not one. Scar on his jaw was still new-looking, the skin around it still tight. He was 41 years old, and he had been shot 11 days ago, and he was standing in dress uniform because he believed in marking transitions correctly, and she found herself, for the first time in a very long time, not managing how she felt about a person, but simply feeling it. "You're going to be good at this," he said. "I already am," she said. And then, because it was true, and she was tired of not saying true things, "Thank you. For the calls, for countersigning, for all of it. You'd have figured it out without me. Probably. Slower. And alone." He held her gaze for a moment, and there was in it the specific, quiet acknowledgement of two people who had been through a valley together without ever being in the same place at the same time, and who had spent 6 years existing in the same memory from different directions. "Take care of your lung," she said. "Take care of your floor," he said. He left. She stood at the nursing station and watched him go, and then looked at the commendation envelope in her hand for a moment and put it in her bag and picked up the next chart. Public reckoning came in pieces, as it always did. Fitch's resignation was reported in the local paper first, then picked up by a defense industry outlet that had been following the Kilo 7 inquiry review. Criminal charges: conspiracy to obstruct a federal proceeding, destruction of government records, and 3 counts related to the contracting fraud were filed 6 weeks after the hearing and made the national wire. The story that ran was factual and dry and contained no altered records, because the journalist who had originally received Vane's documentation had been contacted by Hartwell's office before publication and had, to his credit, sat on it until the authenticity questions were resolved. When the real story ran, it included the backup archive notation. It included the board's finding. It included the acknowledgement that the original inquiry's systemic failure designation had been incomplete and that the removal of a field notification had constituted deliberate interference. It did not name the 2 civilians in the valley. They had names, but they were not Nora's to give to a reporter. They existed in her memory with the weight that the actual dead carry, which is different from and heavier than the weight of any document. She did not expect a public record to resolve that. She had stopped expecting resolution to feel like what she had imagined it would. What she had not expected was the morning 3 days after the charge into Hargrove, and found a different quality in the air of the nursing floor. Not celebration, nothing so clean or collective. More like the specific atmospheric change of a space from which something that had been pressing on it had been removed. Pam was at the station. "Interim director starts Monday," she said. "I heard. She's from Johns Hopkins. Trauma background." Pam paused. "Sheila thinks she's going to reorganize the emergency response protocols." "She should," Nora said. "They're outdated by about 4 years. You should tell her that." "I will." Pam looked at her. "You're different," she said. "How?" "You stand differently." She considered it. "Not, I don't mean confident. You were always that." More like she searched for it. "Like you're not holding something anymore." Nora thought about that. Thought about it while she did her rounds, and while she updated charts, and while she sat with the 43-year-old cardiac patient who had missed his daughter's soccer tournament, but whose recovery had progressed well enough that he was going home Thursday, and who told her that his daughter's team had won, and who cried a little when he said it. She sat with him in that and did not rush him out of it. She thought about it during the lunch she ate in the break room, which she now ate with Pam most days, and occasionally with Marcus, who was growing into his competence in the specific, uneven way of young clinicians who were starting to understand that the job was not about being fast or impressive, but about being reliable in the way that mattered when it was hard. She thought about what Pam had said. Like, you're not holding something anymore. She had been holding the removed notation for 6 years, not the original flag that had lived in the backup archive, without her knowing, patient and intact, waiting for the right question to be asked of the right system. She had been holding the space where it should have been, the negative shape of something excised, carrying the weight of an absence. The record now contained the notation. The board's finding acknowledged the interference. The archive existed and was accessible and named what it named. The absence had been filled. She was not naive enough to think that meant everything was repaired. The 2 houses in the valley were not repaired, and the lives inside them were not repaired. And the operational failures that made those 12 hours possible were systemic in ways that one investigation could address and could not erase. She knew the difference between accountability and remedy. She'd always known it. But she also knew that there was a difference between carrying a truth alone and having it exist outside, at yourself in a form that could be read. The truth had existed outside her for 3 weeks now. She was learning what it felt like. It felt like being able to put her hands on a table and not need them to be doing something. The trauma response protocol meeting happened on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after Fitch's resignation, in the hospital's main conference room, with the interim director a lean, direct woman named Dr. Sandra Obi, who had arrived from Johns Hopkins with a reputation for restructuring things that needed restructuring and an impatience for the kind of institutional inertia that disguised itself as process. Nora had prepared a 12-page document. She had worked on it over 3 weekends, pulling from her field experience and her nursing practice and the specific gaps she had observed in Hargrove's emergency response procedures over 2 years of watching them perform under pressure. She had not shown it to anyone before the meeting, not because she was uncertain of it, but because she had learned that the moment you showed a document to people before a meeting, you were negotiating the document instead of the ideas. She put it on the table in front of Obi and said, "This is a proposal for an integrated trauma response protocol that combines combat medicine triage principles with civilian emergency nursing practice. The gap between field trauma care and in-hospital emergency response is broader than most civilian facilities acknowledge, and it costs time in the situations where time is the resource." She paused. "Can walk you through it, or you can read it first." Obi looked at her. She had the specific quality of attention that came from a career of assessing people, quickly reading competence and bullshit with equal efficiency. Picked up the document and read the first 3 pages while Nora waited. Then she set it down. "Walk me through it," she said. They were in that room for 2 hours. Cook was there, and 2 attending physicians, and Sheila, and the head of the emergency department who had replaced Cook's role in this management structure during the transition period. Not everyone agreed with every element. The attending physicians pushed back on 2 of the triage categories, and Sheila had logistical concerns about the supply chain implications that were legitimate and needed to be addressed. Cook said almost nothing for the first hour, and then asked a question in the second hour. That was the right question. The question about the failure mode. What the protocol looked like when it broke, how you built a procedure that failed safely rather than catastrophically. It was a good question. She told him so, which surprised him visibly, and then she answered it. When the meeting ended, Obi walked out with her. "How long have you been working on this?" Obi asked. 2 years, roughly. I didn't have a forum for it before. You have one now. Obi looked at her with the direct, assessing attention she seemed to apply to everything. "I want a pilot program. 3 months, this floor, measurable outcomes. The data supports expansion. We go hospital-wide." She paused. "You'll lead it." "I'm a staff nurse. Not as of next week." Obi said it without ceremony, which was the right way to say it. "I'm creating a clinical protocol development position. It's been needed here for a long time, apparently. You're the right person for it." She paused at the elevator. "Any objections?" Nora thought about the apartment with nothing on the walls. Parking structure with its orange light. The parking space with the coffee cup that had long since been cleared away. The way she had arrived 14 months ago carrying 2 bags and no interest in making an impression. "No," she said. "No objections." Obi nodded, pressed the elevator button, and stepped in. The doors closed. Nora stood in the hallway for a moment. The hospital moved around her gurneys and footsteps, and the low machinery of a place engaged in the ongoing unspectacular work of keeping people alive. She had spent 2 years being nobody here, and the nobodiness had been deliberate and necessary, and also, she could admit now, a form of fear she had dressed up as practicality. The story she had told herself, that she was hiding from her past, was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she had been afraid that her past, if it caught up with her, would define her in ways she couldn't control. What she had not predicted was that her past catching up with her would not define her at all. It would simply become part of what she was made of. Combat medic was still in her hands in the way they moved, in the assessments they made before her conscious mind caught up, in the specific calibration of pressure that had kept a man breathing on a ceremony lawn. The nurse was in her patience, her observation, her understanding of what people needed in the hours, and days after the crisis was technically over. The woman who had spent 4 years being carefully nobody was in her knowledge of what it cost to disappear, and what it cost more to stay disappeared, and what it meant to stop. None of these were separate things. She walked back to her floor. In February, 4 months after the ceremony shooting, Daniel Marsh was cleared for full duty and reassigned to a training command in Virginia close enough that he was no longer entirely theoretical, which she found she had no strong feelings about, and then found that she did, actually, and filed that away as something to examine at a later date when she had time for it. He sent her a text when his orders came through. "Virginia. Apparently someone decided the East Coast needed more of me. she replied. Your lung is 12 weeks old. Don't do anything stupid with it. Define stupid. Anything that requires a needle decompression. Pause then. Fair. She was in a supply room when the exchange happened, taking inventory with the particular focus of someone who found physical ordered tasks restoring. She put the phone in her pocket and went back to counting and thought about the specific absurdity of a person who had saved a man's life in a field and then spent 3 years ignoring him in a backup archive, coming to rest here in a hospital in Crestford, Virginia, counting trauma supplies on a Tuesday afternoon, with a clinical protocol position and a commendation in a drawer at home and a name she was using again. Her name, Adrienne Voss, who had been a soldier and was now a nurse and would have told you if asked that those were not opposites, that the things you learned in one life did not stay in that life they came with you, whether you wanted them to or not, whether you were ready to use them or not. The thing about being underestimated, she had found, was that it told you more about the people doing the estimating than it ever told you about yourself. Cook had looked at her scrubs and her silence and decided he knew what was inside them. Fitch had looked at her employment file and decided she was nobody worth watching. The institution had looked at her notation and decided it was easier to remove than to address. None of them had been right. They had simply had the authority to act on being wrong, which was a different thing from being right, and a thing that institutions confused for the same thing so routinely it had almost stopped being remarkable. She had stopped being quiet for their convenience. That was, she thought, the actual story, not the investigation, not the archive, not the charges filed and the director resigned and the warrant executed at an airport. Those were the consequences of the story. The story was smaller and more interior. A woman who had spent 6 years believing that the only way to survive with an inconvenient truth was to be invisible, discovering that the inconvenient truth was precisely what made her visible in the way that actually mattered. She finished the inventory. She clipped the list to the supply cabinet and walked back to the floor. There was a new admission in room 3, post-surgical, anxious, asking questions that the orderly who'd brought them up had not had the time or training to answer. She heard the voice through the half-open door before she reached it. She pushed the door open. Hi, she said. I'm Voss. I'll be your nurse today. The patient looked up, mid-40s, tired, the specific frightened, but trying not to show. It expression of someone in an unfamiliar body, in an unfamiliar room. She had seen that expression thousands of times. It never got routine. Can you tell me what's happening? The patient asked. Nobody's explained anything. That's what I'm here for, she said, and pulled the chair to the bedside and sat down and began to explain. Outside the window, the February sky was the flat white of a season not yet finished. The frost was gone, the same frost that had been on the grass the night she had stood at Marsh's window and felt a door she had locked beginning to move. The ground was brown and bare and waiting. The way ground was in the pause before what came next. Inside the room, a nurse was talking to a frightened person in plain, accurate language, telling them the truth about where they were and what was happening and what to expect. It was not a dramatic thing. It was the most important thing she did every day. Some people spend their lives waiting to be taken seriously by the wrong rooms. They adjust their voice, minimize their history, make themselves smaller in the hope that smaller is easier to accept. And sometimes that patience is survival real, necessary, the kind that keeps you in the game until the game changes. But there comes a moment when the game changes not because the room finally decides you're worth its attention, but because you stop needing it to. Because you bring what you carry into the space without apology, and you do the work, and the work is undeniable. That is not a triumph that happens to you. It is one you build, in the dark, alone, for years out of the things you refuse to put down, even when putting them down would have been easier. Adrienne Voss had carried hers for 6 years through a valley and a backup archive, and a parking structure, and a conference room and a hearing room in Arlington. She had set none of it down. She had simply learned, finally, to use all of it at once.